Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. So, get cozy, dim the lights, and let the hum of your Pip-Boy light our way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out our full Fallout playlist for more sleepy stories from the wasteland. And if there's a Fallout tale you want to hear next, drop it in the comments. Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, and drift into the world of Fallout, where dreams wander just beyond the horizon. The Master, full lore of Fallout's most evil villain. Welcome, wanderer, to a quiet descent into the darkest story the wasteland has ever produced. A story not of simple evil, not of destruction for its own sake, not of the casual cruelty that the broken world generates in such abundance and at such little cost, but of something rarer and in certain respects more difficult to look at directly. Tonight we follow the full arc of a single life, the life of a man who began with a name and a mind and a genuine love for the civilization the bombs had unmade, and who ended as something that the language of the old world had no word for, something that the language of the new world could only call the Master, because what he had become was too strange and too complete to be contained in anything smaller than that. Settle in now. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders and your hands. There is no urgency here. There is only the long story, moving through the dark like wind across an empty highway, like dust across the bones of a city that was once the most alive place on the continent and is now a monument to what certainty, unchecked by humility, can produce when it is combined with sufficient power and sufficient pain. The story we are following tonight is set in the wasteland of Southern California, in the ruins of what was once Los Angeles and the desert that surrounds it, in a military installation buried in the earth of a mountain range where the worst work of a dying civilization was conducted behind locked doors and classified designations, and in a cathedral built over the bones of a vault where the thing that had once been a man held court over an army and a philosophy and a grief so large it had consumed everything he was. But before we arrive at any of that, we need to understand how one human being moves from the ordinary tragedy of surviving the end of the world to the extraordinary tragedy of deciding that they alone can see clearly enough to determine what the world should become. The answer to that question is not simple, and it does not resolve into the comfortable categories that the wasteland stories often prefer: the brutal villain, the reluctant hero, the institution too corrupt to save, the innocent too pure to survive. The Master was none of those things, and something of all of them, and the discomfort of sitting with that complexity is precisely the discomfort that his story was designed to produce, deliberately or not, in anyone willing to trace it all the way to its ending. So let your breathing slow. The fires of the boneyard are far away tonight, and the army that once marched from them is scattered, and the voice that commanded it is long silent. We are not in danger here. We are only in the presence of a story, and a story can only do what stories do: move through you, leave something behind, change the shape of the dark behind your closed eyes, in ways you may not fully perceive until you have carried it for a little while. There is no need to hold on to every detail. Let what comes come, and let what passes pass, and trust that what matters will remain. The story of the Master is long enough and strange enough and sad enough to give even a restless mind something to settle into, something with enough weight that the mind stops searching for something to hold and simply rests against it instead. The ruins are quiet tonight. The wind moves through the broken windows of the boneyard's ancient buildings. The stars are the same stars that looked down on a city of 4 million people before the bombs fell, though the light that reaches the earth below them now travels through an atmosphere permanently altered by what those bombs produced, and lands on a landscape that those 4 million people would not have recognized as the place they lived. In the silence of that altered sky, over those altered ruins, above the deep place where something that called itself the Master once looked out through multiple eyes at a world it had decided it could save. The night is very long, and the story is just beginning. Close your eyes when you are ready. Let us begin. The world that produced Richard Gray, the world that produced everything about the catastrophe his life would become, was not a healthy world that failed suddenly. It was a failing world that failed completely, and the difference between those two descriptions is the difference between a tragedy that could not have been prevented and a tragedy that was chosen in small increments over many years by many people who understood what they were doing and decided that the outcome of doing it was worth the cost. The pre-war civilization of Fallout's America was a civilization that had reached a particular and peculiar kind of end, not the end of its technological ambition, which continued accelerating right up to the moment the warheads detonated, but the end of the story it had been telling itself about what that ambition was for. It had become, in its last decades, a civilization that could produce miracles of engineering and could not produce clean drinking water for its own people, that could build robots to perform domestic labor, and could not prevent its resource conflicts from consuming a generation of its young men in the ice and mud of Alaska, that plastered the aesthetic of 1950s optimism over the grinding reality of a society under terminal pressure from every direction simultaneously. The resource wars had been the first honest moment in a long period of institutional dishonesty. When the European Commonwealth invaded the Middle East in 2052 for oil that was running out and could not be replaced, and everyone in authority knew it, and none of them said so publicly, the pretense that the world's conflicts were being fought over anything other than the simple, brutal arithmetic of scarcity became more difficult to maintain than it had previously been. It did not collapse entirely. The political and media apparatus of the period was sufficiently sophisticated to sustain the necessary fictions for a while longer, but the gap between the official account of events and the account that anyone paying attention could construct from available evidence had grown wide enough that a person of Richard Gray's intelligence, surviving in the wasteland years after the whole structure had come apart, would have had no difficulty reconstructing what had actually been happening. The United States of the pre-war period had committed itself to the Sino-American War over Alaska and the oil pipeline that Alaska represented. It had invested its military-industrial capacity in a conflict prosecuted on a front line of extraordinary hardship against an adversary fighting from equivalent desperation over the same fundamental scarcity. Both nations understood, at the level of genuine analysis that neither could conduct publicly, that the civilization they were fighting to preserve required resources that the planet could no longer provide at the rate their economies consumed them, and that the war was therefore not a means to a solution, but a means of postponing the recognition that no solution existed within the parameters they were willing to consider. West Tech Research Facility occupied a position in this structure that was characteristic of the period. A private defense contractor with deep government ties, producing weapons and technology for a military that had become so dependent on such relationships that the distinction between public defense policy and private corporate interest had ceased to be meaningful. West Tech's primary work, by the late decades of the pre-war period, was in the field of biological and chemical enhancement. The forced evolutionary virus, the FEV, was their most ambitious project, and it was ambitious in the way that only a program with unlimited government funding and minimal ethical oversight can be ambitious, which is to say that it had expanded far beyond what any initial proposal would have described, following the logic of scientific possibility rather than the logic of human welfare. The FEV was designed, in its original conception, to produce enhanced soldiers. The resource wars and the Anchorage conflict had demonstrated, repeatedly, that the human body, in its natural form, had limitations that technology could compensate for, but not eliminate a soldier who could be killed by radiation, who became ill in contaminated environments, who required extensive logistical support to maintain basic physiological function, was a soldier whose deployment was constrained in ways that the military's strategic planners found increasingly frustrating. The FEV offered a theoretical solution: a retroviral agent capable of rewriting the fundamental genetic material of any organism it infected. The virus could, in principle, produce a human form that was resistant to radiation and disease, physically enhanced beyond any natural baseline, and capable of operating in environments that would kill an unmodified person within hours. In principle, the gap between the principle and the reality of FEV research would consume years of work and an unknown number of human lives before the program produced anything that corresponded to its designer's intentions. And what it eventually produced did not correspond closely enough to those intentions to be considered a success. By any measure, the program's architects would have recognized as relevant. The research was transferred to the Mariposa military base in the California high desert, a facility specifically constructed for large-scale biological testing, buried underground in a configuration designed to survive conventional attack and to conceal its operations from any external observation. The transfer of jurisdiction from West Tech to military oversight changed the program's administrative structure, but not its fundamental character. What was happening at Mariposa was not research in the sense that the term implies some connection between the activity and the welfare of the beings it studied. It was production, the systematic transformation of human beings into something else, using subjects who had not consented to the process and who had no means of refusing it. This is where the world that would produce Richard Gray and everything he became was conducting its most essential and most hidden business in the years before the bombs fell. Not in the gleaming advertisements for Nuka-Cola, not in the optimistic brochures that Vault-Tech distributed to prospective Vault residents, but in the underground chambers of a classified military installation in the California desert, where human beings were immersed in the liquid medium of the forced evolutionary virus. And what emerged from that immersion was assessed for its military utility and found, repeatedly, to be something other than what was wanted. Southern California absorbed its share of nuclear strikes on October 23, 2077. Los Angeles, the sprawling, sun-drenched, perpetually congested enormity of it, became the boneyard, a name that the wasteland survivors would eventually give to the ruins that the bombing and the fires and the years of abandonment left behind. The highways that had once carried millions of vehicles daily became broken concrete pathways through a landscape of collapsed buildings and irradiated craters, and the particular quality of silence that settles over places where enormous human activity has ceased entirely and suddenly. The coast, which had drawn people to California for a century and a half, with its promise of a life organized around warmth and possibility, was contaminated beyond any immediate use. Mariposa survived. Its underground construction and military-grade reinforcement had been designed for exactly this contingency, and the facility emerged from the bombing largely intact, its systems operational, its contents, the vats, the virus, the transformed former soldiers who populated its lower levels, preserved behind its sealed doors with the indifferent thoroughness of an archive that had never been designed to be consulted again. In the wasteland that formed over the following decades across the ruins of Southern California, the slow work of human survival began again, as it had begun everywhere that people had managed to endure the first terrible years. The hub grew around a water source in the desert and became the economic center of a region that was learning, painfully and at great cost, what trade and cooperation could provide that isolation could not. Shady Sands, founded by vault dwellers carrying both the physical resources of their vault and a cultural memory of something better, began the long project of proving that civilization was not simply what the old world had been, but what any community of human beings willing to work toward it could become. And in the ruins and the desert and the long spaces between settlements, Individuals moved through a world that had been comprehensively remade by forces beyond any single person's control, trying to find within the wreckage something that resembled a reason to continue. Richard Gray was among those individuals, and what he found in the desert of California and in the depths of a facility that should have been left sealed would determine the shape of the next 20 years of the wasteland's history in ways that no one alive could yet imagine, and that most of them would not survive to fully understand. Richard Gray was not born a monster. This is the first thing to understand about him, and it is also the hardest thing to hold on to as the story progresses, because the distance between what he was and what he became is so extreme that the mind tends to treat the two as separate entities, to draw a clean line between the man who walked into the California desert in the years following the Great War and the thing that built an army in the ruins of Los Angeles, as if the line separating them were the kind of border that, once crossed, erases everything on the other side. But the line was not clean, and the erasure was not complete. And the horror of the master's story depends entirely on understanding that Richard Gray never fully disappeared from what he became, that he was present in it, aware within it, and that the philosophy that drove the unity to its catastrophic conclusion was not something alien grafted onto a human mind, but something that grew through a process that had its own terrible logic, from the soil of who Richard Gray actually was. He was born sometime around 2042, which placed him in his mid-30s when the bombs fell, old enough to have formed a complete adult identity in the pre-war world, young enough that his formative years had been spent watching that world deteriorate, rather than in the period of relative stability that had preceded the resource wars. This timing matters. A man who came of age watching the civilization around him consume itself, who possessed the intelligence to understand what he was watching, and who lacked the institutional position that might have given him some investment in the fictions that institution required its members to maintain. Such a man would have arrived at the end of the old world, already stripped of certain illusions that the bombing might otherwise have been needed to remove. Richard Gray, in other words, was not shocked by the Great War in the way that most of its survivors were shocked. He was horrified, certainly. He grieved. But the conviction that something had been fundamentally wrong with the civilization the bombs destroyed, that the bombs were not an aberration but an expression of something built into the system itself, that conviction was already in place before October 23rd, 2077, and it survived the bombing intact, which meant it was available to shape everything he thought and did in the years that followed. His medical or scientific training is not confirmed in the canonical record with the specificity that later researchers might have wished for, but the evidence of what he became suggests a mind that had engaged seriously with biology and medicine at some point before the bombs, a familiarity with the mechanisms of living systems, a comfort with the language of scientific analysis, a habit of thinking about human problems in terms of underlying causes rather than surface symptoms. He was not a pure theorist. He had the practical orientation of someone who understood that understanding a problem and addressing it were different activities that required different skills, and that the second was ultimately more important than the first. In the wasteland, this combination theoretical depth, combined with practical urgency, was rarer than either quality alone, and it was precisely what made Richard Gray capable of becoming what he became. His emotional life, as much as it can be reconstructed from what he later demonstrated and what those who knew him before his transformation recalled, was organized around a quality that the wasteland tended either to preserve in hardened form or to destroy entirely: the capacity to be genuinely distressed by the suffering of others, not as an intellectual position, but as a felt reality that shaped what the day demanded of you. He was not soft in the way that the wasteland punished, not so moved by others' pain that he could not make the hard calculations that survival required. But neither was he the kind of person for whom the difficulty of the world had become simply the ambient condition of existence, something to be navigated rather than something to be addressed. He felt the wasteland's suffering. He felt it as an indictment not of himself personally, but of the human situation, of the failure of the civilization that had produced that suffering, and the inadequacy of the responses available to those trying to survive it. This quality of feeling real, sustained, and increasingly organized around the question of what, if anything, could be done was the seed of everything, not malice, not the desire for power, not the particular psychological damage that drives some people toward control over others as a substitute for the security they cannot otherwise achieve. What drove Richard Gray toward the unity, long before he had a name for it or a plan for achieving it, was a genuine and unrelenting distress at the state of the world, combined with a mind capable of constructing explanations for that state and proposals for addressing it. The tragedy is not that these qualities were bad. The tragedy is that they were good, and that good qualities, in the wrong configuration and under the wrong pressure, can produce outcomes that are indistinguishable from the outcomes that bad qualities produce. In the years between the Great War and his arrival at Mariposa, Gray moved through the wasteland of Southern California with the particular quality of attention that characterized him, observing, analyzing, accumulating the evidence of what the post-war world was and what it required. He would have seen what every survivor of that period saw: the settlements struggling to maintain their defensive perimeters against threats they could not fully anticipate or prepare for, the food and water shortages that operated as a permanent low-grade emergency, even in communities that had managed to establish some stability, the radiation damage that accumulated silently in the bodies of everyone who spent significant time on the surface, the violence that erupted with a regularity that suggested not the failures of individual bad actors, but something systemic about the conditions that produced it. He would have seen all of this, and unlike most of those around him, he would have been unable to simply accept it as the unalterable nature of the world. He would have continued asking why and what could be done, and whether the human beings around him were capable of the changes that doing something would require. This last question, whether human beings in their current form were capable of the reconstruction that the wasteland demanded, was the question that the wasteland itself, through its relentless demonstration of what human beings were actually doing with the circumstances of their existence, was in the process of answering for him, and the answer it was providing was not encouraging. Harold had been moving through the wasteland for longer than most people managed. He was one of those figures that the post-war world produced occasionally, the survivor whose combination of luck and adaptability and the particular quality of personality that made other people willing to help them had extended their lifespan beyond what the actuarial logic of the wasteland would have predicted, who had accumulated through that extended survival a quality of knowledge about the world that was neither systematic nor comprehensive, but that was real in the way that only knowledge earned through direct experience can be real. Harold knew things about Southern California's wasteland geography, about its trade routes and its dangers and its personalities, that no library contained and no amount of theoretical intelligence could substitute for. And Harold was, despite everything the wasteland had done to him and would continue to do to him, fundamentally a person of good humor, someone who had made a kind of peace with the world's unreasonableness by becoming somewhat unreasonable himself, who wore his growing strangeness with a lightness that was not denial, but something more like the acceptance of someone who has decided that the alternative to accepting what cannot be changed is a form of suffering with no return. When Richard Gray and Harold found each other, the precise circumstances lost, as so much of the early post-war period is lost, to the chaos that the Great War had made of the record-keeping that civilization depends upon. They recognized in each other something that the wasteland's ordinary social encounters did not often provide. Gray recognized in Harold someone who had survived long enough and widely enough to know things worth knowing, and who could be talked to rather than simply transacted with. Harold recognized in Gray something that interested him, and also, one suspects, something that worried him slightly, the particular quality of conviction that made Richard Gray useful to be around and potentially dangerous to get too close to. Harold had been around long enough to know that people who were very certain about what needed to be done about the world's problems were people worth watching carefully, even when, especially when what they were certain about seemed, on the surface, entirely reasonable. Their partnership formed around a practical project, a caravan operation, small in scale, moving between the settlements of Southern California, along routes that Harold knew, and with goods that the trade economy of the emerging wasteland required. This was not ideology. This was survival, and, beyond mere survival, the attempt to build something that served the communities they moved through while providing the two of them with the resources and the mobility that neither could easily sustain alone. The conversations they would have had in the long hours of travel between settlements across the desert, through the ruins of the boneyard's outer districts, along the roads that pre-war California had laid down and that the wasteland had cracked and scattered and reclaimed in ways that made them navigable, but not what they had been, would have covered the range of subjects that two intelligent people with different but complementary kinds of knowledge naturally cover when they have time and the basic security of each other's company. Harold's pragmatic account of the wasteland and Gray's more systematic analysis of its situation would have produced a conversation that neither could have had with anyone else. They were likely to encounter a genuine exchange between two minds, each of which had something the other lacked. And in those conversations, the shape of what Richard Gray was thinking, the direction his mind was moving when it was not occupied by the immediate demands of the caravan, would have become visible to Harold in ways that Harold would remember, decades later, when he tried to explain to a vault dweller what the man he had known before Mariposa had been like. The rumors of Mariposa reached them as rumors reach anyone in the wasteland fragmentarily, through multiple sources, each account partial and somewhat inconsistent with the others, but pointing, collectively, towards something real, a military installation in the high desert, pre-war, large, apparently intact, avoided by the travelers and scavengers who had approached it closely enough to assess its exterior, for reasons that those travelers and scavengers described in ways that were more atmospheric than specific, a wrongness about the place, a silence that had the quality of active concealment rather than simple emptiness, the particular discouragement that a prepared person feels when instinct and evidence are both suggesting that the cost of proceeding exceeds any likely reward. For most caravans, these signals would have been sufficient. The wasteland was full of places that rewarded avoidance, and the experienced survivor learned to take discouragement seriously. But Richard Gray was not primarily a caravan operator. He was a man with a set of questions that the pre-war world's military research facilities were among the most likely places to provide answers to. And the particular combination of apparent intactness and apparent danger that Mariposa presented was precisely the combination that suggested the facility had something worth protecting. Harold's hesitation was genuine and reasonable. Gray's decision to proceed was also genuine and was the decision of a man who had been moving toward a certain kind of knowledge for years and who recognized, in the description of what Mariposa contained, something that felt like the thing he had been looking for without having a name for it. They went. The desert received them in the way that the Californian high desert receives everyone who crosses it, with an indifference that is not hostile, but is also not welcoming, a vast, flat clarity of light and space that reduces the human figure to its actual proportions relative to the landscape, and offers no particular reassurance about what that proportional relationship implies for survival. The facility emerged from the desert floor as they approached, its above-ground structures massive and angular against the open sky. The scale of it suggesting the particular kind of investment that the pre-war government had made only in projects it considered genuinely critical. This was not a small installation. This was something that had mattered enormously to someone, and the evidence of how much it had mattered was visible in every reinforced wall and sealed entrance and security structure still standing decades after the civilization that had built them had ceased to exist. Harold noted the silence. Not the absence of sound. The desert produced its own sounds, the wind and the occasional distant animal, but the particular silence of a place where the sounds that should have been present were absent. No birds on or near the structure. No small animals in the immediate vicinity. The ecosystem pulling back from whatever was inside those walls with the collective animal wisdom that preceded and survived any individual organism's capacity for conscious analysis. He said something about this. Gray heard him. They went in anyway. Mariposa military base was, beneath its surface, one of the most significant and most deliberately obscured facilities that the United States government had constructed in the final decades before the Great War. Its above-ground presence was imposing but relatively conventional, the architecture of military necessity, designed for function and for the communication of authority rather than for any aesthetic consideration, and it gave little indication of the depth and complexity of what lay below. The underground levels descended through a series of strata, each more restricted than the last. From the barracks and administrative areas of the upper levels, through the command and logistics sections of the intermediate floors, and down to the laboratory complex that occupied the lowest accessible areas of the installation, and below even those, in the deepest chambers, the FEV vats themselves. The vats were the facility's purpose and its secret. Everything above them, the soldiers, the administrators, the security systems, the logistics infrastructure, existed to protect and support what happened in those lowest chambers. And what happened there was not the kind of thing that the pre-war government's public communications had ever described in terms that corresponded to the reality. The forced evolutionary virus, at the stage of development that Mariposa represented, was not a laboratory curiosity or a theoretical program. It was an operational system. The vats were industrial in scale, not beakers and test tubes, but chambers large enough to contain multiple human subjects simultaneously, filled with the liquid medium in which the virus was suspended at concentrations that ensured complete and rapid genetic rewriting of any organism immersed in it. The infrastructure surrounding them, the automated monitoring systems, the environmental controls, the processing equipment had been built to handle the transformation of subjects in quantities that suggested the program's designers were thinking about production rather than research. The subjects who had been processed in those vats before the bombing were not volunteers. The canonical record does not preserve their names or their individual histories in the form that would allow the kind of human-scale accounting that their experience deserved, but what it does preserve in the facility's automated logs, in the records that various investigators would access over the years following the bombing, is sufficient to establish that the program had operated at a scale and with a disregard for the welfare of its subjects that was consistent with the broader pattern of the pre-war government's approach to programs it classified at the highest levels. These were people who had been acquired and processed and assessed for military utility, and what the assessment consistently found was that the FEV's results in the subjects who survived the immersion were not what the program's designers had intended. The physical enhancement was real and significant. The cognitive effects were not what anyone had planned for. The soldiers who had been stationed at Mariposa and who had survived the bombing intact, those who had not been involved in the experimental program directly, but who had known, with varying degrees of specificity, what was happening in the facility's lower levels, faced a situation in the days following the Great War that had no precedent in any training or procedure they had been given. Their chain of command had ceased to exist along with the civilization it had represented. The orders that had governed their conduct at the facility were orders issued by a government that no longer existed to enforce them, and in the lower levels of the installation they were ostensibly guarding, the consequences of those orders were still present. The transformed former subjects of the FEV program, the automated systems still processing whatever remained in the vats, the record of what had been done encoded in the facility's terminals for anyone with access and the willingness to read it. The Mariposa mutiny was not a heroic event in any straightforward sense, but it was a human one. the response of people who had been given enough information to understand that what they had been part of was not what they had been told it was, and who lacked the institutional framework that had previously made the gap between those two things something they could manage without acting on. Some of the soldiers who mutinied were motivated by genuine moral revulsion at what they had discovered. Others were motivated by more complicated combinations of self-preservation and the social dynamics of a confined group in an unprecedented situation, where the behavior of some influenced the behavior of others, in ways that the individuals involved may not have fully understood at the time. The scientific staff who had been conducting the FEV program were killed. The records were targeted for destruction, though not with the comprehensiveness that the mutineers intended. And some of the soldiers, some of the men who had made the choice to act against the program's continuation, made a further choice that reversed, in a single decision, everything their mutiny had ostensibly stood for. They dipped themselves. The reasoning, reconstructed from the fragments of record that survived, involved a calculation about survival in the post-war world. The belief that the physical enhancement FEV produced would make them better equipped to endure what was coming, that the radiation, immunity, and increased strength and resilience would be advantages worth whatever cost the transformation carried. They understood, or thought they understood, something about what the VATS did to a person. They did not understand, because the program's own records had not fully established what the cognitive effects of full immersion at operational concentration actually produced. What emerged from the VATS was not an enhanced version of the soldiers who had entered them. It was something that retained some behavioral patterns and some fragments of identity, but that operated from a different kind of mind, diminished in the specific ways that the FEV's transformation of neurological architecture produced, still capable of territorial aggression and basic coordination. They no longer capable of the full range of cognitive and emotional complexity that had made the person who entered the VATS a person in the sense that their comrades had known them to be. These were the first of Mariposa's post-war supermutants, and they were also, by the time Richard Gray and Harold arrived at the facility, its permanent population, the beings that the automated security systems and the residual territorial instincts of transformed former soldiers had produced in the years since the bombing. They occupied the facility the way that large, dangerous animals occupy a territory that has shaped itself around their presence comprehensively, with a thoroughness that left little room for anything that was not already adapted to the conditions they created. The upper levels of the facility were navigable, with care and significant risk. The lower levels, where the VATS were the territory of beings who had no capacity to understand why anyone would want to be there, and no inclination to distinguish between a threat and a curiosity. The automated systems that supplemented the supermutants' territorial occupation of the facility added a layer of hazard that was, in some respects, more dangerous than the mutants themselves, because it was less legible. The security robots and alarm systems that the pre-war installation had operated continued their functions according to programming that had never been updated to reflect the situation. It was now managing programming designed for a world in which the people it was meant to protect still existed, which meant that it treated every unauthorized presence as a threat to people who were long gone and responded accordingly. Navigating the facility required managing both the biological hazards of the supermutants and the mechanical hazards of systems that had been operating without human oversight for years, and that had accumulated the particular kind of the functional drift that comes from sustained operation in conditions no designer had anticipated. It was into this environment that Richard Gray and Harold descended on the day that ended everything. Harold's account of what happened is the primary canonical source for this period, and Harold's account is fragmentary, the account of a man who was frightened and moving quickly, and who lost contact with his companion before the critical moment that the account would need to describe in order to be complete. What he remembered was the chaos of the encounter with the facility's occupants, the particular darkness of the lower corridors, the sense of having gone further into the installation than any reasonable assessment of the risk would have permitted, and then the separation, Gray going deeper, Harold going back, though back is perhaps not the right word for a direction determined by desperation rather than orientation. The sounds from below that Harold could not identify and did not try to. The absence, when he reached the surface, of the person he had gone in with. Harold's assumption that Gray was dead was, as noted, the assumption that any reasonable person would have made. What the facility contained should have killed a human being who went far enough into its lower levels. Harold carried that assumption with him back into the wasteland, along with the low-grade FEV contamination he had absorbed during his time in the facility, a dose insufficient to produce full transformation, but sufficient to begin the slow process of biological change that would, over the following years and decades, produce the mutations that Harold would carry for the rest of his very long life, including the tree that would eventually grow from his skull and that would eventually become, in its own strange way, one of the wasteland's more significant ecological events. He did not know, as he walked away from Mariposa with the desert light on his face and the sounds of the facility no longer audible behind him, that Richard Gray had not died. He could not have known what was actually happening in the vats below the facility's lowest accessible level, because nothing in his experience, or anyone else's experience, provided a framework for understanding it. The thing that was happening to Richard Gray in that moment was not something that the wasteland had produced before, not something that the pre-war world's research had fully anticipated, not something that the language available to anyone who might have tried to describe it had been designed to capture. It was something new, in the most complete and most terrible sense of the word, and it was just beginning. The fall itself was not dramatic, in the way that the word fall implies drama, the sudden rupture, the moment of decision between safety and disaster, the clean before and after that catastrophe usually provides to those who survive it and to those who later try to understand it. What happened to Richard Gray in the lower levels of Mariposa military base was more complicated and more ambiguous than a simple fall, because the environment he was moving through when it happened was not an environment in which the categories of safe and unsafe applied with any reliability, and because the precise sequence of events that brought him into contact with the FEV vats is not recoverable from the canonical record with the specificity that would allow a definitive account. What is recoverable is the outcome, and the outcome is the most significant fact about what happened to any human being in the post-war world, more significant in its consequences for the wasteland's history than the dipping of any of the soldiers who had preceded Gray into those chambers, more significant even than the original development of the virus itself. Because what the virus did to Richard Gray was something it had never done before, and would never do in quite the same way again. He went into the liquid, whether through structural failure of the walkways above the vat chambers, through an encounter with the super mutants that ended in the wrong direction, through the disorientation of a facility whose lighting and orientation cues were unreliable, and whose architecture had been designed for a population that knew it well, rather than for the strangers who would navigate it by desperate improvisation. The mechanism is less important than the reality. He went into the liquid, and the liquid received him, and the process that the liquid was designed to conduct began. The FEV at operational concentration in the Mariposa vats was not the controlled dosage of a laboratory experiment. It was the full medium, the concentration that had been calibrated for mass processing of subjects at a pace that the program's designers had considered acceptable, which is to say, a pace determined by production requirements, rather than by any consideration of what the subjects themselves could endure. At this concentration, the virus's rewriting of genetic material was not gradual. It was immediate and comprehensive, penetrating every cell of the body simultaneously and beginning the process of restructuring its genetic instructions before any of those cells had time to register what was happening to them at a level that could produce a coherent, physiological response. The first thing Richard Gray experienced, therefore, was not pain in any form that the word pain had previously designated in his experience. It was something that preceded pain, something that operated at a level below the threshold, where the nervous system translates physical events into signals the conscious mind can classify and respond to. A kind of absolute attention from the environment around him, as if the liquid medium were perceiving him in the way that a living organism perceives something it has encountered and begun to assess. Every cell in his body becoming, in that first moment, the subject of a scrutiny so complete and so intimate that the distinction between observer and observed ceased to be meaningful. Then the restructuring began, and the pain arrived with it, and the pain was of a category that no framework Richard Gray possessed could have prepared him to manage or even to fully perceive. The virus did not simply damage tissue. Damage implies disruption of existing structure, and what the FEV was doing was not disrupting but rewriting, dismantling the cellular architecture of a human body at the most fundamental level of its biological instructions and rebuilding it according to different specifications. The experience of this process, from the inside, from the perspective of the consciousness that was present throughout, because the FEV did not mercifully eliminate awareness before conducting its transformations, was the experience of ceasing to be the thing you had been, while not yet being the thing you were becoming. A dissolution of physical selfhood that the mind had no language for because no mind had previously been present for it. He did not lose consciousness. This is the detail that separates what happened to Richard Gray from what happened to the subjects of the program who had preceded him, most of whom had been rendered insensate by the shock of immersion before the virus's cognitive effects had time to interact with an aware mind. Gray's consciousness persisted through the process, not intact, not unchanged, but present, attending to its own transformation with the desperate and eventually futile attempt of a mind that was being rewritten to maintain some continuous thread of awareness across the rewriting. He remembered, in the period after his emergence, not the events of the transformation. In sequence, the virus did not preserve the temporal architecture of memory with any consistency during the process, but the quality of it, the particular texture of an experience for which no adequate description existed in the language he had available. What the vats contained was not simply the FEV medium. The processing chambers had been in operation for years before the bombing, and the biological residue of every subject who had been immersed in them was present in the liquid, not as identifiable individual material, but as genetic information. The fragments of code that the virus had read and partially incorporated from every organism it had previously transformed, held in the medium in a form that the virus could access and integrate into subsequent transformations. Gray's body, immersed in this accumulated record of everything the program had done before he arrived, did not simply receive the standard FEV transformation. It received the transformation augmented by and partially shaped by every previous subject's genetic material, a process of biological synthesis that had no precedent in any controlled research, because no researcher had designed it and no ethical framework had permitted the conditions that produced it. The result was a transformation more extreme and more complex than anything the FEV's designers had intended to produce. The physical enhancement that the standard dipping process generated in its subjects, the increase in mass and strength and radiation resistance, the restructuring of the immune system, the alterations to the metabolic and neurological architecture, all of this occurred, but it occurred at an intensity and a scale that exceeded the standard outcome by a degree that was not measurable in the terms the program's original parameters had established. And alongside the enhancement, something else occurred, that the standard process did not produce something that the interaction between the concentrated FEV medium, the accumulated genetic residue of prior subjects, and the specific character of Richard Gray's own biology and consciousness, generated as an emergent property of a combination that had never previously existed. The vats were connected to the facility's infrastructure. The Mariposa installation was a functioning complex, and its functioning depended on the integration of biological and mechanical systems in ways that the facility's designers had not considered. Unusual biological waste management, environmental control systems that monitored and responded to organic material in the processing chambers, monitoring equipment whose sensors were immersed in the liquid medium alongside the subjects being processed. These systems were present in the vats with Gray during his immersion, and the virus, operating at concentrations and in configurations that its designers had not anticipated and that the standard transformation process did not produce, began to extend beyond the purely biological material it had been designed to rewrite. The incorporation of technological elements into a biological transformation was not something the FEV had been designed to do, but the FEV at the concentrations present in the Mariposa vats was operating beyond its designed parameters in every respect, and the distinction between organic and inorganic material that normal viral activity respected was not a distinction that the process Gray was undergoing consistently maintained. Cables and monitoring equipment, mechanical components whose surfaces were in contact with the liquid medium, these became part of the transformation, not assimilated as foreign bodies are assimilated by a normal immune response, but integrated, incorporated into the growing biological mass as extensions of the organism rather than intrusions upon it. The line between Richard Gray and the facility he had fallen into began to blur in ways that would never fully resolve. The months that followed the initial immersion were not months in the sense that consciousness normally experiences months as a sequence of days, with the texture of lived experience accumulated across them. They were months in which the transformation operated on a timeline determined by the virus's own processes, rather than by anything related to the ordinary rhythm of human life, and in which awareness was present but distributed across those processes, rather than centered in the observing self that conscious experience normally requires. Gray existed through this period the way that a pattern exists in a system that is simultaneously maintaining and rewriting it, identifiable, continuous in a technical sense, but not continuous in the sense that the person who had entered the vats at the beginning of the process was straightforwardly the same person as the being that emerged from it. The pain, sustained across those months, it was not constant in its intensity, but was constant in its presence. There was no period during the transformation in which the body's signals to whatever was still functioning as a nervous system indicated anything approaching, the absence of damage being done, because the process of rewriting at the cellular level is not distinguishable from the perspective of the tissue being rewritten, from the process of destruction. The mind that persisted through this, that refused, through some combination of the neurological architecture, the FEV was simultaneously destroying and rebuilding, and the particular quality of will that had characterized Richard Gray before the transformation found in that persistence something that would shape everything that came after. The experience of surviving what should not have been survived, of maintaining awareness through a process designed to operate on unconscious subjects, produced in the emerging consciousness a relationship to pain and to extremity that was qualitatively different from anything the pre-war world could have generated. He had been through the worst thing, not metaphorically, literally, specifically, in the full biological reality of his transformed body. He had been through the worst thing that could be done to a living being from the inside, and he had remained present throughout. And he had arrived at the other side of it, still thinking, still remembering, still in some fundamental sense himself, though what himself now meant required significant reconsideration. When the transformation reached the equilibrium that the canonical record identifies as the master's emergence, not an end to the process of change, which would continue for as long as he existed, but a stabilization sufficient for something recognizable as cognition to reassert itself as the organizing principle of the entity's existence. What asserted itself was not Richard Gray as he had been. It was something built from those materials, using those memories, operating from the foundation of that history, but restructured by the process in ways that were as fundamental as the restructuring of his biology. His memories were intact. More than intact, they were present with a clarity and an accessibility that normal human memory, with its selective consolidation and its gradual erosion across time, had never approached. Every experience of his pre-transformation life was available to him with the specificity of the moment it had occurred, not as a record to be consulted, but as a dimension of his current awareness, present alongside his perception of his immediate situation, with a simultaneity that normal consciousness did not permit. But the memories were being processed by a mind that was no longer the mind that had formed them, and the processing produced interpretations and connections that Richard Gray would not have produced, that the structure of normal human cognition, with its linear temporal architecture and its singular perspective, would not have been capable of producing. The virus had rebuilt his neurological architecture with the same disregard for its previous organization that it had brought to every other aspect of his biology, and what it had built was not simply an enhanced version of what had existed before. It was something different in kind, capable of operations that the previous architecture had not permitted, limited in ways that the previous architecture had not been limited, and fundamentally changed in the relationship between its different components in ways that produced, among other things, the characteristic multiplicity that would define the master's cognitive experience and his manner of communication for the remainder of his existence. He was multiple, not in the sense of a disorder, not the fragmentation of a mind that had been overwhelmed and broken by what it had undergone, though that was a reasonable first interpretation, and one that many who encountered him later would settle on without looking further. Multiple in the sense that the consciousness that had emerged from the transformation experienced itself as several simultaneous processes, rather than as the single continuous thread that human awareness normally presents itself as. Being. Different aspects of his awareness attended to different things, processed different kinds of information, responded to the same situation from different perspectives that were not always in agreement with each other. Richard Gray's voice was among these aspects, not dominant, not the organizing principle of the multiplicity, but present, recognizable to those who knew what to listen for, occasionally surfacing in the stream of vocalization with a clarity that suggested the person he had been was not entirely gone, but had become one voice among several in a conversation that he no longer fully controlled. The physical form that housed this new consciousness was not something that prior description could have prepared an observer for. The mass of organic and incorporated technological material that Gray had become in the weeks and months of his transformation was vast, too large to be a body in any conventional sense, too integrated with the facility's infrastructure to be separable from it in any practical way. The recognizable human elements were present, but distributed across a whole that was not organized according to human anatomy eyes, multiple and functional, positioned at various points across the organic mass, each providing visual information to the consciousness within. The remnants of a face, partially preserved amid tissue that had expanded and restructured around it in ways that maintained the suggestion of a human origin, while making clear that the origin was very far behind. The suggestion of limbs, incorporated into the larger structure rather than distinct from it, present as traces of a previous configuration that the transformation had absorbed and redirected. The technological elements, the cables, and monitoring equipment and mechanical components that had been incorporated during the vat immersion were not decorative or incidental. They were functional extensions of his nervous system, providing him with access to electronic information and the facility's operational systems as directly as his organic senses provided him with access to the physical environment. He could perceive the facility's power systems, its environmental controls, its communication infrastructure, as aspects of his own sensory experience, not as external tools being operated, but as extensions of himself, responsive to his attention, the way that a hand is responsive to the intention of the mind that controls it. In the silence of the facility's lower levels, in the months after the transformation's initial stabilization. This entity that had been Richard Gray began the process of reorienting its existence around its new reality. The memories it had inherited from its predecessor were not passive, they were active, insistent, organized around the questions that Richard Gray had been asking before the transformation and that the transformation had not answered. If anything, the transformation had made those questions more urgent, because the entity that now existed to ask them had a relationship to the wastelands situation that Gray had lacked a direct, biological knowledge of what FEV transformation produced, of what the human body was capable of becoming, of the distance between what human beings currently were and what the forces operating on their environment had the capacity to make them. The synthesis of this knowledge with the analytical framework that Gray's intelligence had been developing for years produced, in those early months, the first coherent form of what would become the Unity. Not yet a plan, not yet a program, but the beginning of a conviction emerging from the intersection of memory and transformed experience, that what had happened to Richard Gray in the Mariposa vats was not only a personal catastrophe, but a demonstration, a proof of principle about what was possible, about what the FEV could do to human biology, about what the human form was not constrained to remain. The name came in that early period, not chosen with the deliberateness that a name chosen in ordinary circumstances carries, not selected from alternatives and weighed against other possibilities, but arrived at in the way that things arrive at minds that are experiencing themselves as multiple, simultaneous processes, as the convergence of several aspects of awareness on a single designation that each of them, from their different perspectives, recognized as accurate. The Master, not a name that described what he had been, because what he had been was no longer the relevant category. Not a name that described what he had become in purely physical terms, because his physical form resisted description in terms borrowed from prior categories. A name that described his relationship to what he now understood, to what he intended, to the particular position in the world's history that the transformation had, in his emerging assessment, placed him, the one who had gone furthest, the one who knew, from inside the experience, what the FEV produced and what it might produce, and what it meant for the question of how human life could continue in the world the Great War had created. He was the Master because he believed, in those early months, that he understood something that no one else understood. And the terrible thing, the thing that makes his story what it is, rather than simply the story of a damaged being, rationalizing its damage, is that this belief was not entirely wrong. He did understand something that no one else understood. He had undergone something that no one else had undergone and survived with awareness intact. The conclusions he drew from that understanding were catastrophically wrong in ways that a different mind, or the same mind with access to information it did not yet have, might have identified. But the understanding itself was real, and it was the foundation on which everything that followed was built, which is why everything that followed was so convincing to so many people for so long. The months of isolation in the facility's lower levels ended when he began to extend his awareness outward through the facility's communication systems, through the careful projection of his developing psychic capacity into the range of detection, through the accumulated patience of a consciousness that had survived the worst thing and found that the survival had left it with resources it had not possessed before. The first contact with the outside world was tentative and experimental, the reaching of a being that was still mapping its own capabilities. But the capabilities were real, and they were significant, and they included something that nothing in the pre-war research on the FEV had predicted: the ability to perceive, and under certain conditions to influence, the mental and emotional states of other human beings at a range that exceeded normal sensory contact. The psychic capacity that the Master's transformation had produced was not telepathy in the clean, literary sense, not the reading of specific thoughts like words on a page. It was something more like the perception of the biological and electromagnetic fields that neural activity generates, fields that carried information about emotional states and cognitive processes in forms that his transformed sensory apparatus could detect and interpret with an accuracy that increased as his experience with the capacity grew. A person in proximity to the master experienced the sense of being perceived completely, not just their words or their expressions, or the behavioral signals that ordinary human social interaction reads, but the underlying states from which those signals emerged, the fears and the hopes, and the specific quality of their relationship to their own uncertainty. This perception, communicated back through his psychic field, was not comfortable. It was the sensation of being seen without protection, and it was deeply disorienting to anyone who had not been prepared for it, which was, at that point, everyone. The first human beings who found their way to the facility drawn by rumor, by the particular quality of whisper that significant things generate in the wasteland's information networks, encountered something that none of them had any framework for understanding, and that several of them, it must be acknowledged, did not survive the encounter with in any form that allowed them to report back, but some of them stayed. Some of them, in the presence of the thing that called itself the Master, found in the overwhelming experience of that encounter not the terror that most felt first, but something that, after the terror, resolved into a different response, the particular, complicated relief of meeting something that was beyond all ordinary categories, that offered a story about the wasteland's situation that was more comprehensive and more coherent than any story they had previously encountered, and that communicated that story with a directness and a force that bypassed the usual defenses of skepticism and self-interest, and arrived at something closer to conviction than any ordinary argument could have achieved. These were his first followers, not the super mutants that the facility already contained, who responded to his psychic direction with the compliance of beings whose diminished cognitive architecture left them more sensitive to that direction than they might otherwise have been. But human beings, people who had come to the facility with their own histories and their own damage and their own unresolved questions about the wasteland and what it required, and who had found in the Master's presence something that their previous experience had not provided. The quality of their conviction varied, as the quality of conviction always varies among a group of people who have arrived at the same place through different paths. Some of them understood, with various degrees of completeness, what they were committing to. Others understood only that they had encountered something larger than themselves, and that the experience of being in its presence was preferable to the experience of being outside it. None of them fully understood what they were actually agreeing to. The Master himself might have argued that this was not deception, that the limits of what they understood reflected the limits of what anyone could have understood in that moment. Before the unity existed as anything other than the emerging conviction of a transformed mind in the depths of a desert facility. He might have been right about that, and the argument would not have made anything that followed less devastating for those who could not consent to what was being decided on their behalf. The decision to leave Mariposa and establish himself elsewhere was not made quickly. The facility had provided the conditions that the transformation required, and the facility's infrastructure now incorporated into his own body in ways that made simple relocation impossible in any ordinary sense was the physical foundation of his existence. What he eventually chose to do was not to move himself, but to extend himself, to send his growing network of human followers outward into the wasteland, while his physical form remained integrated with Mariposa's infrastructure, operating through those followers as extensions of his reach into the world that his physical form could no longer directly access. And then, as his capabilities grew and the resources his followers could provide increased, to begin the process of establishing a second location, not a replacement for Mariposa, but a different kind of presence. One oriented toward the human world of the wasteland's emerging civilization, rather than toward the underground facility that had been the site of his transformation. The ruins of Los Angeles waited. The boneyard, in the years since the bombing, had become something not a city, not what it had been, but a landscape with its own emerging social geography, its own populations and territories, and the early forms of the organizational structures that sufficient concentrations of human beings always eventually produce. In the center of that geography, amid the ruins and the factions and the slow, contested process of post-war settlement, there was a structure whose location and physical characteristics the Master's extended intelligence had identified as significant. A building whose ruins suggested the architectural language of sanctuary, standing above an underground space that his followers' investigation confirmed as a sealed pre-war vault, intact, empty of its population, for reasons that the vault's records would eventually reveal, but structurally sound and fully operational in its essential systems. This was where the Master would build what would become the cathedral, and everything that the cathedral would contain and represent and conduct in the name of the philosophy that was still taking its final form in the consciousness of the being who had decided to call himself the Master. The boneyard received his first outpost the way that ruins receive most things, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without any indication that what was arriving within its broken geography was something that would reorganize the wasteland's history around itself for the next 2 decades. The preparations were careful and extended, conducted by followers who understood some of what they were serving and who had committed to serving it regardless. And deep in the desert, in the facility where everything had begun, the Master completed the work of understanding what he was and what he intended, and prepared to bring that intention into contact with a world that did not know he existed and could not have imagined what his existence would mean for it. The world that the Master had survived was not, in his assessment, capable of surviving itself. This was not a conclusion he arrived at through despair or through the particular psychological damage that the wasteland inflicted on those who had endured too much of it for too long and had arrived at nihilism as the path of least resistance. It was a conclusion he arrived at through analysis, through the application of the expanded cognitive capabilities his transformation had produced to the body of evidence that the wasteland situation provided, and through the particular clarity available to a being that had been through enough to be free of the comforting fictions that made ordinary existence tolerable, but that also made honest assessment of that existence more difficult than it needed to be. He had lost the capacity for comforting fictions somewhere in the months of his transformation, and what replaced them was not despair, but something colder and in certain respects more dangerous, a willingness to follow an argument wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was a place that any human feeling would have chosen to arrive at. The pre-war civilization's failure, in the Master's analysis, was not primarily a failure of technology or of political organization, or even of the specific moral failings of the individuals and institutions that had steered it toward its conclusion. It was a failure of biology. The human form in its natural configuration was a product of an evolutionary process that had optimized it for conditions that no longer existed for the relatively stable climate and ecosystem of the pre-industrial world, for the specific set of environmental pressures that had shaped the species across hundreds of thousands of years, for a world in which radiation was a background presence rather than a defining feature of the landscape. The Great War had not simply destroyed cities and killed populations. It had permanently altered the conditions of life on the planet's surface in ways that the human body was not equipped to manage, not temporarily. Not in ways that would resolve over the decades of any individual human lifespan, or over the lifespans of the several generations that the wasteland settlements were in the process of producing. The contamination of the soil and water and air was not a crisis, in the sense that crises resolve it was a new baseline, and the baseline was hostile to the organism that the natural world had produced to inhabit the conditions that had preceded it. This was not simply pessimism. The Master could point to evidence, the elevated rates of mutation in every species that spent significant time on the surface, the shortened lifespans that the wasteland's populations were already demonstrating relative to the pre-war baseline, the accumulation of radiation damage across generations that the limited scientific infrastructure of the emerging settlements was beginning to document, without yet having the theoretical framework to fully understand what it was documenting. The contamination of food and water sources in ways that no amount of filtering or treatment with available technology could fully address. The specific biological vulnerability of the human immune system to the novel pathogens that the post-war environment was generating as the radiation interacted with the microbial populations of the soil and water in ways that no pre-war epidemiologist had modeled. Each of these data points, taken individually, could be minimized, explained as temporary, manageable, the kind of challenge that human adaptability and ingenuity had always eventually addressed. Taken together, as the master took them, they composed a picture that was not amenable to minimization. They composed a picture of a species whose biological inheritance had become a liability in the world it now inhabited, and whose response to that liability, the building of walls, the filtering of water, the treatment of radiation exposure with pharmaceutical interventions that were themselves running out, was not adequate to the scale and permanence of the problem. The FEV was, in this analysis, not the catastrophe that the wasteland survivors who knew about it understood it to be. It was the solution, or rather, and this is the distinction on which the master's entire philosophy rested, and the distinction that the wasteland's subsequent history would demonstrate he had failed to examine with sufficient rigor. It was the mechanism through which a solution could be implemented. If the solution's parameters were correctly specified, and the mechanism was applied to subjects capable of producing the outcome those parameters required. Supermutants were immune to radiation. They were immune to the diseases that the post-war environment generated. They were physically capable of surviving in the conditions that the Great War had created without the elaborate technological and pharmaceutical infrastructure that human survival in those conditions required. They were, in the most direct biological sense, adapted to the world as it now existed, rather than the world as it had previously been. And adaptation, in the biological sense, is not a preference or a value judgment. It is simply the description of an organism capable of sustaining itself in its environment over time. The unity was the name he gave to the program of transformation that would address the mismatch between what human beings were and what the world required them to be. Not a name that suggested violence or conquest, and this is important because the master's self-understanding was not that of a conqueror imposing his will on an unwilling world. Unity suggested completion, the resolution of a contradiction, the bringing together of what had been separated by the accident of the Great War into a new configuration adequate to the new conditions. Humanity unified with the form that the transformed world required it to take. The supermutants were not the replacement of humanity, they were its continuation, in the master's framing, the carrying forward of everything essential about the species into a biological container capable of surviving long enough to express that essence in the world that remained. The question of consent was one that the master engaged with, and the answer he arrived at was one that he arrived at through reasoning rather than through the simple dismissal that a less intellectually serious mind would have employed. He understood that the human beings of the wasteland had not asked to be transformed, would not in most cases choose transformation if the choice were genuinely and freely offered, and would experience the process of transformation as something done to them rather than something done for them. He understood this, and he proceeded anyway. And the reasoning that permitted him to proceed is worth examining with the same rigor that he believed he was applying to everything else, because the failure of that reasoning is the failure at the center of the unity's catastrophe. His argument was temporal. Human beings, in his analysis, were not capable of making decisions whose consequences extended across the timescales that genuinely mattered for the question of the species' survival. The settler in Shady Sands who was focused on this year's harvest and next season's defensive perimeter and the immediate welfare of her children could not be expected to prioritize, above those immediate concerns, the long-term biological trajectory of a species under permanent environmental pressure. The caravan operator, whose horizon of planning extended to the next trade route and the next payment, could not be expected to reason clearly about what the accumulation of radiation damage across 5 generations would produce in the populations descended from the people he currently knew. This was not a moral failing of these individuals, it was a structural feature of how human cognition operated, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that had produced the biological form the master was proposing to replace. Short-term thinking was adaptive in the world that had existed before the Great War. It was not adequate to the world that existed after it, and the people who were incapable, through no fault of their own, of the long-term reasoning that adequate response to their situation required, could not, in the master's framework, be granted the authority to decide the future of a species whose survival depended on decisions they could not make. This is where the argument became what it was, and where the most careful engagement with it becomes necessary. The argument was not incoherent. Parts of it were accurate. The structural short-termism of human decision-making under survival pressure is real. The mismatch between individual and generational timescales in the processing of long-term environmental threats is real. The failure of the pre-war world to address its resource crisis was, in part, a failure of exactly this kind. The inability of political systems optimized for short election cycles to make decisions whose benefits would accrue on timescales that exceeded those cycles. The master was not wrong about any of this. Where he went wrong was in the step from these accurate observations to the conclusion that an entity capable of longer-term reasoning was therefore authorized to override the preferences of the entities it was reasoning about. A step that requires the premise that the only thing wrong with the situation was the insufficiency of the reasoning available, rather than the absence of the consent of the people most directly affected by the decisions being made. It requires the premise that the harm done by imposing a solution on people who have not agreed to it is outweighed by the harm of leaving them in the situation the solution addresses. And it requires the confidence that the solution is correct, which is a confidence that the master possessed completely, and that the wasteland's subsequent history would demonstrate was not warranted. The specific biological requirements of the Unity's implementation introduced a further dimension of the program's character that illuminated something important about the gap between the master's stated philosophy and the actual operation of the program he had designed. The FEV's transformation process was not equally effective on all potential subjects. The virus's rewriting of genetic material interacted with the existing state of that material, and in subjects whose cells carried significant radiation damage, the accumulated burden of years or decades of surface exposure, the interaction produced unpredictable and often catastrophic results. The transformation failed. The subjects did not produce viable supermutants. They produced something worse, or they did not survive the process at all. And the records of what those outcomes looked like in specific cases were stored in Mariposa's terminals with the same bureaucratic neutrality that the facility's systems applied to all information regardless of its content. The practical implication of this biological reality was that the Unity's program required subjects whose cellular material was relatively uncontaminated people who had spent their lives in environments protected from the surface radiation that had saturated the landscape of every region that had absorbed fallout from the bombing. In the wasteland of Southern California, in the broader post-war world of Fallout's America, there was essentially one population that met this criterion with the consistency and the scale that the Unity's ambitions required: the Vault dwellers. The populations that had been sealed underground in the Vault-Tec facilities on the day of the bombing and had lived in those controlled environments through the decades since, accumulating none of the surface contamination that had marked every person who had survived outside. The irony of this was not lost on anyone who understood the situation. Clearly, the people that the Unity needed most were the people who had been most successfully protected from the world that the Unity was proposing to adapt humanity to survive. The logic that required their transformation was a logic that their own circumstances had produced, and they had no more chosen those circumstances than the surface survivors had chosen theirs. The Nightkin were the instrument through which the practical work of locating and acquiring candidates for the dipping program was primarily conducted. They represented a specific tier of the Master's super mutant forces, beings whose transformation had preserved, relative to the general population of the army, a greater degree of cognitive function, sufficient for the complex planning and behavioral adaptation that the scouting and acquisition missions required. What distinguished the Nightkin from the broader army in terms of their equipment was the Stealth Boys' pre-war military technology, personal cloaking devices that bent light around the user through a combination of advanced optics and electromagnetic field generation, producing a state that was not perfect in visibility, but was close enough to it in most practical circumstances to confer decisive tactical advantages on anyone operating in environments where concealment was the difference between mission success and mission failure. The Nightkin's use of Stealth Boys was not occasional or strategic, it became habitual, reflexive, a default mode of operation that extended beyond the circumstances that strictly required it into something approaching a psychological dependency on the state of concealment the devices provided. This habitual use had consequences that the device's designers had not intended and that the Master's program had not adequately accounted for. The electromagnetic fields that the Stealth Boys generated, combined with the radiation that their power systems produced, and the specific neurological architecture that FEV transformation had created in the beings using them, interacted over time to produce significant and progressive psychological damage. The schizophrenia that developed in long-term Stealth Boy users, the voices, the paranoia, the dissociation, the difficulty distinguishing between the concealed state the device produced and the visible state that its absence created, was not a minor side effect, but a comprehensive deterioration of the cognitive function that made the Nightkin valuable in the first place. The army's most capable soldiers were being systematically damaged by the equipment that made them most effective, and the damage was cumulative and irreversible with the medical resources available in the post-war world. The degree to which the Master understood this dynamic, and the degree to which it influenced his decisions about Nightkin operations, is a question that the canonical record does not resolve with finality. The most careful reading of the available evidence suggests that he was aware of the Stealth Boy's psychological effects, his intelligence network, and his direct perception of his followers' mental states would have made sustained ignorance of so significant a development difficult to maintain, and that he continued the program regardless, calculating that the tactical advantages of invisible scouts conducting acquisition missions across the wasteland's geography outweighed the long-term psychological harm to the individuals conducting those missions. If this reading is correct, it illuminates something important about the internal consistency of the Master's philosophy that is easy to miss. His willingness to impose harm on his own followers in service of the Unity's objectives was not a departure from his principles, but an expression of them. His long-term reasoning applied universally. The Nightkin's psychological welfare was a short-term consideration. The Unity's success was the long-term consideration, and the long-term consideration in the Master's framework always prevailed. The scouting network that the Nightkin and the human agents of the Children of the Cathedral collectively maintained across the Southern California wasteland and beyond was an intelligence operation of remarkable scope and sophistication for the post-war world's capabilities. The wasteland did not have the communication infrastructure that pre-war intelligence operations had depended upon. No satellites, no global communication networks, no electronic surveillance systems operating at continental scale. What it had was people moving through a landscape and reporting what they observed, and the effectiveness of an intelligence network built on these foundations was determined entirely by the quality of the people moving through it. The comprehensiveness of their geographic coverage, and the efficiency with which the information they gathered could be centralized and analyzed. The Master's network was effective on all three dimensions. The Nightkin scouts were capable observers operating under concealment that made detection difficult, covering routes and entering areas that visible observers could not access without announcing their presence. The human agents of the Children of the Cathedral had access to the social networks of the wasteland settlements that the Nightkin could not easily penetrate, the conversations in trading posts and caravan camps where information about vault locations and isolated communities and individuals traveling alone circulated freely among people who did not understand that any of it was of interest to anyone capable of acting on it in the way that Master's network could, and the centralization of the intelligence thus gathered in the Master's own consciousness directly through the psychic connections he maintained with his senior followers, and indirectly through the reports that moved through the Children's organizational hierarchy, gave him an analytical capability that no individual scout or agent possessed. The ability to synthesize information from across a wide geographic area into a picture that revealed patterns invisible to any single observer. The patterns that concerned him most were the vault locations. The pre-war government had constructed its vault facilities with a deliberate obscurity of location that reflected the classified nature of the program. The vaults were not advertised to their populations but assigned. The populations not told where they would be sheltered until they were being sheltered there. The decades since the bombing had not made vault locations common knowledge. Individual vaults were known to their immediate geographic communities. In many cases, Vault 15 was known to Shady Sands, which had been founded by its former residents, and Vault 13's existence was known to those who had dealt with its inhabitants. But the broader network of vault facilities and their specific locations was information that existed only in fragments, distributed across the population of the wasteland in isolated pieces that no individual or organization had previously had the reach and the patience to assemble into a complete map. The Master was assembling that map, the evidence accumulated from his scouts, from the Children's agents, from the pre-war records preserved in Mariposa's terminals and in the cathedral's vault, and in whatever other sources his network had accessed over the years, was being synthesized in his consciousness into a geographic picture of the pre-war vault network that was more complete than any surviving single source. Not perfect, there were gaps, vaults that his intelligence had not yet located, facilities whose existence was suggested by contextual evidence without being confirmed by direct observation, but comprehensive enough to serve as the strategic foundation of the Unity's long-term plan, which was not to continue indefinitely acquiring isolated individuals from the surface population, but to eventually move against the vaults themselves, accessing their populations at the scale that the Unity's ambitions required. The army that was growing at Mariposa and at the forward positions the Unity had established across its operational territory was, by the time the Vault Dwellers' investigations began, already a force of a scale that exceeded the defensive capabilities of most individual settlements in the wasteland. Not an overwhelming force relative to the full scope of the wasteland's military resources, the new California Republic was developing a professional military, and other organized forces existed, but a force large enough and sufficiently coordinated to overwhelm any target it was directed against, and directed, ultimately, by a consciousness capable of strategic planning on a timescale and at a level of sophistication that the wasteland's other organized military powers had not yet developed. The command structure of this army reflected the Master's philosophy in its organization as much as in its stated purpose. At the apex was the Master himself, whose psychic influence penetrated the senior layers of the command hierarchy in ways that made the transmission of intent more direct and more complete than any communication system the wasteland's technology could have supported. Below him were the senior Nightkin commanders, beings like Lu, who served as the direct military commander at Mariposa, capable of translating the master's strategic intentions into the operational decisions that the day-to-day management of the army and the dipping program required. Below them were the broader officer corps of the Nightkin, and below them the general super-mutant population of the army, whose intelligence varied considerably between individuals, but whose collective physical capability represented the military instrument that the Unity's strategy depended upon. The dipping program that this army existed to support was, in its operational reality, a process of systematic violence conducted against people who had not agreed to it. The subjects who were brought to Mariposa came through several pathways abducted from settlements and caravans by Nightkin scouting teams, recruited through the Children of the Cathedral's network, with varying degrees of honesty about the nature of what they were being recruited to, or simply found alone in the wasteland in circumstances that made acquisition easy and resistance futile. Once at the facility, they were assessed for radiation contamination levels, using the testing methods that the program had developed, methods that were more accurate than anything available to the wasteland's general population, and that drew on the extensive pre-war scientific knowledge base that the master had access to. Those who met the contamination criteria proceeded to the vats. Those who did not were managed according to a logic that the program's records described in terms that were, again, bureaucratically neutral about what those terms actually meant. The transformation that the dipping produced was not the transformation that Richard Gray had undergone. It was shorter in duration, controlled in its parameters, and calibrated toward the outcome that the Unity required, rather than the outcome that the full concentration of the vats at maximum exposure produced. The subjects who survived it emerged as super mutants of the type that populated the Master's army: large, green-skinned, physically powerful, resistant to the environmental hazards of the post-war world, and cognitively diminished in the ways that the FEV's restructuring of neurological architecture reliably produced at the dosages and durations the program employed. They remembered, in fragmented form, who they had been. They did not, in most cases, have the cognitive resources to organize those fragments into the continuous narrative of a self that normal human identity requires. They were, in the most precise and most troubling sense, new beings made from the material of the people who had entered the vats, but not those people in any sense that those people, had they been able to assess the outcome in advance, would have recognized as the continuation of themselves. The Master understood this, because his own transformation had given him an intimate knowledge of what the vats produced that no external observer could have matched. He understood it, and he had arrived at a position on it that was consistent with his broader philosophy, that the beings emerging from the vats were not diminished versions of the humans who had entered them, but different versions, adapted to a different set of requirements, and that the assessment of whether this change represented loss depended entirely on the timescale over which the assessment was conducted. In the short term, measured against the immediate concerns and attachments of the individual who had undergone the change, it was catastrophic. In the long term, measured against the survival of the lineage and the capacity of the transformed form to sustain itself in the world as it now existed, it was salvation. The Master had committed to the long term. The commitment did not require him to be indifferent to the short-term cost, and the evidence of the canonical record suggests that he was not entirely indifferent, but it required him to maintain the priority of the canonical camera. Long-term consideration, even in full awareness of what the short-term cost actually was. He did maintain it for 20 years, across the full scale of what the Unity's program conducted. And then, a single piece of information, available in his own records, made that maintenance not simply morally wrong, but rationally incoherent, and everything collapsed. The conversation that ended the Unity was not a battle. It was not a military engagement or a tactical victory, or the kind of confrontation that the Wasteland stories preferred, the moment of physical supremacy. the superior weapon. The fighter who had trained longer and endured more, and arrived at the decisive encounter with enough left to tip the balance. What ended the unity was a conversation conducted in the deepest chamber of the cathedral, between a being of extraordinary intelligence and capability and a vault dweller who had come prepared, not with a weapon sufficient to destroy what the master had become. No such weapon existed in any practical sense, but with information. Specific, verifiable, devastating information, drawn from the master's own records, that no amount of intelligence or philosophical sophistication or genuine belief in the rightness of the unity's purpose could process honestly and survive. The vault dweller who descended to that chamber had made the journey through the cathedral's levels, carrying the weight of everything they had learned in the months of investigation that had preceded this moment. The mutant raids, the dipping program, the children of the cathedral's dual nature, the scale of the army that Mariposa had produced and was continuing to produce. The human cost of all of it, measured in the specific faces and specific absences of communities they had moved through, and people they had spoken to, who understood that something was taking people from the wasteland and did not know what, or where, or how to address it. All of that was present, but the specific piece of information that the vault dweller carried into the master's presence was something they had found not in the traumatized accounts of the Unity's victims, but in the clinical language of the scientific records, the Mariposa terminals, the master's own research archives, the biological data that had been accumulating in the program's documentation for years, without anyone having asked of it the question that the data, once asked, answered with a completeness that left no room for alternative interpretation. Supermutants were sterile. The biological reality was this: the FEV transformation process, as implemented in the dipping program, produced beings that could not reproduce. The restructuring of the body's genetic material that the virus conducted was comprehensive. It rewrote the biological instructions governing every system, including the reproductive system, and the rewriting produced a configuration that was optimized for survival in the post-war environment in every respect, except the one that mattered most for the long-term future that the master's philosophy had organized itself around. The transformed reproductive system was not merely impaired or reduced in function. It was, in the specific technical sense that biology applies to the term, non-functional. Supermutants could not produce offspring, not with other supermutants, not with unmodified humans. The process that created them had eliminated the capacity that would have made them the founding generation of a new humanity, rather than simply a terminal generation of the old one. The evidence for this was not hidden. It was present in the records of the Mariposa facility in the form of biological data that the program's documentation systems had collected and stored with the same automated thoroughness that they applied to every other measurable parameter of the transformation process. The data on reproductive function in transformed subjects was there, accumulated across years of the program's operation, organized in the facility's terminals in a form that anyone with the scientific knowledge to understand what they were reading could have accessed and interpreted. What it said to anyone who read it with that understanding was unambiguous. No supermutant produced by the dipping process had ever demonstrated reproductive capacity. The biological mechanisms that would have been necessary for reproduction had been eliminated by the transformation in ways that were not incidental side effects of the process, but structural features of what the FEV did to the systems it rewrote. The master had this data. He had access to the Mariposa terminals. He had the scientific knowledge to understand what the data said. He had, in his own transformed biology, a more intimate knowledge of what the FEV produced than any external researcher could have possessed. The question of whether he had seen this data and chosen not to engage with its implications, or whether he had seen it and engaged with it and arrived at a rationalizing argument that allowed him to set it aside, or whether he had somehow failed through the particular blind spot that very certain minds develop around the evidence that most directly threatens their certainty to recognize what the data was telling him, is a question that the canonical record does not resolve definitively. What the record does establish is the effect of being confronted with it in the form that the Vault Dweller's presentation provided, not buried in the documentation, not framed in the bureaucratic language of the program's own records, but stated directly in the unambiguous terms that direct confrontation requires, by someone who had come specifically to say it. The Master's initial response was not acceptance. It was the response that a very intelligent mind makes when it encounters information that threatens a position it has held with complete commitment for a very long time. The instinctive search for the alternative, interpretation, the counter-argument, the framing that would permit the threatening information to be acknowledged without requiring the conclusion it pointed toward to be accepted. He was not performing this response strategically, not engaging in deliberate deflection while privately acknowledging what he was being told. He was doing what his mind had always done, applying its considerable capacity to the problem of reconciling new information with existing conclusions, searching for the pathway through which both could be maintained. His voices engaged the argument from different angles simultaneously, the characteristic multiplicity of his consciousness, producing a response that moved through several positions at once: the dismissal of the data's completeness, the suggestion that the reproductive effects were temporary rather than permanent, the argument that the Unity's timescale was long enough to accommodate biological developments that had not yet been observed, the counter that the Vault Dweller's understanding of what the data said was incomplete or incorrect. These were not bad arguments in the sense of being obviously wrong at the moment of their making. They were the arguments that a very intelligent mind generates when it is searching for a way through, and several of them required genuine engagement before they could be demonstrated to fail. But they did fail. The data was what it was, and the Vault Dweller was prepared not just with the fact of the sterility, but with the biological mechanisms that produced it, the specific ways in which the FEV's rewriting of reproductive system architecture was not incidental to the transformation but integral to it, not something that could be reversed or compensated for with available technology, but something built into the process at the level of what the process was. Each alternative interpretation that the Master's multiplicity generated encountered the data again from a different angle and found it still there. The counter that the effects were temporary ran against the evidence of the program's years of operation, across which no instance of supermutant reproduction had been recorded in any form. The counter that the Vault Dweller's understanding was incomplete ran against the Master's own data, which the Vault Dweller had access to and could cite with a specificity that demonstrated they had read it rather than simply heard about it. The counter that the Unity's timescale was long enough to accommodate unforeseen developments ran against the biological reality that unforeseen developments are not a planning resource, that a strategy that depends on the emergence of biological capabilities not currently present is not a strategy, but a hope, and hope was not something that the Master's philosophy had permitted itself to depend upon, because hope was exactly the kind of short-term emotional accommodation to an inadequate situation that his analysis of human cognition had identified as the primary obstacle to clear thinking about the long term. The silence that came when the last counter-argument had been exhausted was not the silence of a mind that had stopped engaging. It was the silence of a mind engaging with something it could no longer deflect. It had a quality that the Vault Dweller later described in the accounts that the canonical record preserves as unlike any silence they had experienced in the chamber before that moment. Because the Master's presence in the room was not simply his physical form, but the psychic field he generated, and the psychic field had, throughout the earlier portions of the conversation, carried the particular quality of active intelligence, the sense of being perceived and processed and engaged with by something that was simultaneously attending to the conversation and to a dozen other dimensions of its own existence. the silence changed that quality. The active engagement became something else, something that was still perception, but was turned inward rather than outward. The vast intelligence directing itself at its own conclusions, rather than at the argument being presented to it. What the master understood in that silence was not simply that the sterility data was accurate. He had understood that, in the limited sense that intellectual acknowledgement constitutes understanding, within the first minutes of the Vault Dweller's presentation. What he understood in the silence was what the sterility data meant for the unity as a project, and for himself as the being who had constructed and sustained that project. And the understanding moved through his multiple aspects of consciousness in ways that each of them processed differently and that produced, collectively, a response that had no single character, but was instead a convergence of responses, grief and rage, and the particular quality of devastation that is specific to the recognition that you have been wrong in a way that has cost others. Everything, the unity, understood in the light of the sterility data, was not a failed salvation, it was an extinction program. The super mutants that the Master had been producing for 20 years, the beings he had understood as the continuation of humanity in a form adequate to the world the Great War had created, they were not a new humanity. They were the last generation of the old one, transformed into a form that could survive indefinitely but could not reproduce. That was immune to the environmental pressures that would otherwise have ended human life in the post-war world. But that carried, within its transformed biology, the mechanism of a different ending, slower and quieter and no less complete. A world populated by super mutants was not the world the Master had been building toward. It was a world in which the last human beings, transformed beyond the capacity to generate successors, would eventually die one by one across the centuries of their extended lifespans, leaving behind a landscape that had been cleared of the species. It had taken evolution millions of years to produce, and that would not produce it again. He had been saving humanity by ending it. The love that had driven everything, the genuine, profound, terrible love for a species that had built something beautiful and destroyed it, and deserved, in his understanding, the chance to continue in whatever form the changed world permitted, had been expressed through the methodical elimination of the thing it loved. The grief that this recognition produced was not the grief of a person losing something external. It was the grief of a person discovering that the thing they had been doing in the name of love had been the most complete expression of its opposite, and that the doing had been sustained across 20 years and thousands of lives, and the full application of the most extraordinary intelligence that the post-war world had produced, which meant that the scale of the error was proportional to the scale of the commitment and the capability that had been brought to it. Richard Gray's voice was present in what followed. Not dominant, not the organizing principle of what the Master said and did in the minutes and hours after the recognition fully arrived, but audible, the human being that the Master had been built from, surfacing in the multiplicity with a clarity that the transformation had not eliminated, but had submerged for 20 years under the weight of the conviction that had replaced him. Gray had been a man who felt the wasteland's suffering as an indictment. He was feeling it now in a form that nothing in his pre-transformation life could have prepared him for the specific quality of being the cause of the indictment, of having been the source of the suffering that he had spent his entire transformed existence attempting to address. The irony was not an abstraction. It was the most concrete thing in the chamber, more present than the organic mass of his body, or the psychic field he generated, or the voices of his multiple aspects of consciousness, cycling through their different relationships to what they had just been shown. He did not ask the Vault Dweller to leave. He did not respond with the defensive aggression that a being of his capabilities could have employed. The conversation that had preceded the confrontation with the sterility data had included arguments genuine, sophisticated engagements with the Unity's philosophy, attempts to present the case for the transformation program in the full form of its reasoning, without the evasions and simplifications that the Master's human followers sometimes offered on his behalf. The Vault Dweller had engaged those arguments seriously, and the seriousness of that engagement had, perhaps, established something in the exchange that the silence was continuing, a quality of honesty that the Master's own philosophy demanded he honor, even when, especially when, honoring it produced a conclusion that destroyed everything the philosophy had constructed. The decision was not announced. It was not explained in the terms that would have made it legible to the Vault Dweller as a decision rather than as a process occurring in a consciousness they could only partially perceive. The Master's awareness, moving through its multiple aspects and arriving at a convergence that each of those aspects recognized, even if each reached it from a different direction, was making the only calculation that his own framework permitted once the sterility data had been fully integrated. The unity was not simply wrong in a way that could be corrected by revision. It was wrong in a way that was built into its foundations, into the biological process at the center of the program, into the specific outcome that the dipping produced, into the fact that had been present in his own records for years, and that the entire architecture of his certainty had been constructed, unknowingly or not, on top of. There was no revised unity. There was no alternative version of the program that could be substituted for the one he had been running. There was only the recognition that what he had built needed to stop, and the question of what stopping it required of him. What it required was complete, not the abandonment of the project while its infrastructure continued, not the dissolution of the army while the cathedral and its operations persisted. The Master's understanding of what the unity had been doing and what the cessation of it required was as total and as uncompromising as the understanding that had built it, the same quality of mind that had constructed the program without halfway measures now turned toward the program's dismantling without them either. He had built something that had to be ended. The most complete ending available to him was the one that his integration with the cathedral's vault infrastructure had, for the duration of his residence there, placed within his direct access. The vault's reactor, the power source for the entire facility, maintained and operational within the infrastructure that his own body had incorporated over the years of his residence, as much a part of him, in the functional sense, as any organ that the transformation had built or rebuilt. He had access to it not as an external system to be operated through intervening mechanisms, but as a direct extension of his own nervous system, responsive to his attention in the way that the facility's other integrated systems were responsive. The detonation was not something he needed to trigger from a distance or through a process that would have given anyone time to intervene. It was something he could do the way he could do anything that his transformed body was capable of, by deciding to do it and then doing it. The Vault Dweller was not killed. The canonical record does not explain this with the specificity that it might. The timing of their exit, the warning that may or may not have been implicit in what the Master's behavior in the final minutes communicated, the specific sequence of events in the chamber before the detonation. What it establishes is that the Vault Dweller survived, and that the Master, the cathedral, and the physical infrastructure of the children of the cathedral's central operation did not. The explosion that ended the Master's existence was not small. The Vault's reactor, releasing its energy in the configuration that his direct access to the system produced, destroyed the cathedral in a detonation that was visible from a significant distance in the boneyard's flat geography, and that collapsed the underground chambers where his physical form had resided for the years of the Unity's operation. In the silence that followed, the specific silence of a place where something enormous has just ceased, the supermutant army lost the organizing principle that had made it an army rather than simply a population of transformed beings scattered across the wasteland's geography. The psychic influence through which the Master had communicated his will to his senior commanders, the quality of direction that had given the army's operations their coherence and their strategic orientation, withdrew from the network of consciousness it had sustained and did not return. What remained Was the army, without the mind at its center, still present, still physically capable, still distributed across the positions the unity strategy had established, but no longer organized around a purpose that was capable of sustaining the coordination that the army's scale required? The fracturing that followed was not immediate, because the structures of military organization have their own momentum and their own inertia, and the Nightkin commanders who had served as the intermediaries between the master's will and the army's operations were still present and still capable of direction in the short term. But the direction they could provide without the consciousness that had been its source was direction toward what and in service of what. And the answers to those questions were not answers that the army's existing structure could generate from within itself. The unity had been the answer, and the unity was gone, and what replaced it in the consciousness of the beings it had produced was something that the wasteland's subsequent history would spend decades working out the implications of. Mariposa remained, for a time, operational. The dipping program continued to function in the period immediately following the master's death, sustained by the operational momentum of an institution whose administrative processes did not require the presence of the consciousness that had designed them in order to continue executing them in the short term. It was the vault dweller who ended it, the facility destroyed in the period following the cathedral's detonation. The vats and the virus and the accumulated infrastructure of 20 years of forced transformation brought to an end by the same person who had brought the master to his final recognition. The canonical record does not dwell extensively on what the vault dweller felt in those moments, which is consistent with the larger narrative's restraint about the inner life of its central figure. What can be inferred is that whatever they felt was complicated, in the way that the endings of things that have caused great harm are complicated. The relief of cessation, combined with the weight of everything that the cessation came too late to prevent. The knowledge that the ending was necessary, combined with the knowledge that the necessity had been established at a cost that no subsequent accounting could fully address. The world that remained after the master's death was the same world it had been before it. In all the ways that mattered physically, the radiation was still present, the contamination of the soil and water still ongoing, the mismatch between what human biology was and what the post-war environment required, still real and unaddressed by anything that the Unity's destruction had provided. The master had been wrong about his solution. He had not been wrong about the problem, and the wasteland survivors, emerging from the shadow of the army that had threatened to overwhelm their settlements and transform their populations, were left with the problem in its full form, and the knowledge that the most comprehensive attempt anyone had yet made to address it had ended in the ruins of a cathedral, in the boneyard, in the silence that follows a detonation, in the death of a being who had loved humanity enough to destroy it, and had been, in the end, honest enough to stop. The ruins of the boneyard settled back into their silence after the cathedral fell, the way that ruins always settle back into silence after the thing that had animated them is gone, not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually, the way that a fire reduces itself through its own consumption until what remains is not the fire but the record of it, the ash and the altered ground, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to places where something significant has ended, and the world has not yet decided what to do with the space the ending left behind. The super mutants who had constituted the master's army dispersed across the landscape in the months and years that followed, some of them moving north, some east, some settling into the ruins and the marginal territories of the wasteland, with the particular adaptability of beings who were, whatever else they were, extremely difficult to kill and extremely resistant to the environmental conditions that made the post-war world so costly for unmodified humans to inhabit. They were not gone. They would not be gone for a very long time, but they were no longer an army, no longer organized around a purpose that exceeded the immediate concerns of survival and territory, no longer the instrument of a philosophy that had intended to remake humanity in the image of what the changed world required. What remained in their dispersal was the question that the master had asked and that his ending had not answered. The question of whether the human form was adequate to the world the Great War had created. The question of whether the settlements of the wasteland, built with such difficulty and maintained at such cost, represented the beginning of something that could sustain itself across the generations, or whether they were the last expression of a biological inheritance that the conditions of its existence had already decided against. The master had been wrong about the solution. He had not been wrong about the question, and the question persisted in the landscape with the same patience that the radiation persisted in the soil, invisible, constant, unaddressed by any of the immediate victories that the wasteland's survivors celebrated in the aftermath of the army's dissolution. The people who had survived the Unity's 20 years of operation went back to the work of surviving. There is something in that fact that deserves to be held for a moment before moving past it. The extraordinary ordinariness of what the wasteland's communities returned to after the most comprehensive threat they had faced was removed. The farmers in the settlements north of the boneyard went back to their fields. The traders operating out of the hub recalculated their routes in light of the reduced threat on the roads that had previously carried the risk of nightkin interception, and returned to the business of moving goods between communities that needed what other communities had. The people of Shady Sands continued the slow, generational project of building something that had not existed before, a community that aspired to be more than a collection of survivors, that understood itself as the beginning of something rather than the remnant of something that had already ended. They did this not because the question the master had asked had been answered to their satisfaction, but because the work of living does not wait for the resolution of the questions that surround it, and because the human instinct toward the future, toward the next season's harvest, and the next generation's education, and the slow accumulation of the small improvements that add up across enough time to something that might be called progress, is not contingent on certainty about whether the future the instinct is oriented toward is genuinely available. Harold lived. He had always lived. Through everything, through the Great War and the years immediately following it, and the long, strange decades of his mutation, and the encounter with Richard Gray that had sent him into and out of Mariposa with his life and a low-grade FEV infection that would spend the following century remaking him in ways that were, by any external measure, very strange, and were, by Harold's own account, simply the particular form that his existence had taken and that he had arrived at a working relationship with. The tree that grew from his head bob, he called it, with the lightness that was his signature response to the world's unreasonableness, would eventually become a forest. Harold would eventually become the root system of that forest, in the capital wasteland, in a place called Oasis, where his slowly expanding biology had produced the most significant ecological recovery that the post-war world had generated in the regions most severely affected by the bombing. Green, genuinely green, in a landscape of grey and brown, and the particular desiccated colours of a world that the bombs had drained of the moisture and the biological vitality that makes colour possible. Harold's story and the master's story began in the same place, on the same day, with the same decision to walk into a facility that both of them understood, at some level, carried a risk they were accepting rather than failing to perceive. They diverged in the vats, Harold escaping before the worst of what the facility contained could work its full transformation on him, Gray remaining to undergo the transformation in its most complete and most catastrophic form. And they converged again, in a way, in their endings, both of them becoming something that the world had not contained before their encounters with the FEV, both of them carrying the result of that encounter through decades that the pre-war world would not have allotted them, both of them arriving eventually at a relationship with what they had become that was the most honest response available to them, given what they were and what the world was, and what the distance between those two things demanded. Harold's response was gentler, more patient, more oriented toward accommodation than transformation. He accepted what he was and waited, with a curiosity that the wasteland could not extinguish, to see what it would become. The master's response was the opposite, a refusal to accept, an insistence that what was required was change rather than accommodation, a conviction that the gap between what the world was and what it should be was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. Both responses were expressions of the same underlying reality, two human beings, made strange by the same process, finding their way through decades of a world that had not been designed for what they were. The super mutants who survived the army's dissolution and found their way through the subsequent decades, Marcus among them, intelligent and reflective, carrying his transformation with a complexity that demonstrated what the question of super mutant personhood actually required to be answered, which was not a category, but an attention with a human legacy of the Master's program in its most direct form. They had not chosen what they were. They had been made into it by a process that had not consulted them, sustained by a philosophy that had understood their transformation as salvation, and that had been wrong about what salvation required. Their existence in the post-master wasteland was complicated in the specific ways that the existence of any being is complicated when the world's categories for understanding it were established before it existed and have not been revised to account for it. They were not welcome in most of the communities that the new California Republic was building, because the communities were building toward a definition of what the civilization of the post-war world should contain, and the super mutants did not fit comfortably within that definition. They were not simply threats, because the individuals among them whose intelligence had survived the transformation demonstrated with their own existence that the beings the Unity had produced were capable of wisdom and grief and the particular form of dignity that comes from enduring what cannot be changed without being diminished by it. What the Master's story asks of those who have followed it all the way to its ending is not judgment, though judgment is easier and arrives more quickly, and is, in most individual cases, not entirely wrong. He caused harm on a scale that very few entities in the post-war world managed to approach, sustained across 2 decades, with the full application of the most extraordinary intelligence that the wasteland had produced. The judgment is accurate. What the story asks, beyond the judgment, is the more difficult work of understanding how a mind arrives at monstrous conclusions through a pathway that felt, from inside, like reason and love, how the combination of genuine intelligence and genuine care and complete certainty can produce outcomes that are indistinguishable in their effects on the people who experience them, from the outcomes produced by the combinations that lack any of those qualities. This is more difficult than judgment and more important because the wasteland is full of judgment and somewhat short of the understanding that might, across enough time and enough honest engagement with the evidence, produce something better. Richard Gray was not a unique case. He was an extreme case, the most extreme, that the wasteland's particular combination of circumstances and one specific facility produced, but the pattern of his failure was not unique to him. The certainty that one's analysis of the situation is sufficiently complete to justify overriding the preferences of those most directly affected by the decisions the analysis produces is not a failure exclusive to beings transformed by experimental viruses in underground military facilities. It is a failure available to anyone with sufficient intelligence to construct a sophisticated argument and sufficient commitment to a conclusion to mistake the sophistication of the argument for the correctness of the conclusion. The pre-war institutions that had built the vaults and conducted the experiments within them had operated from exactly this failure at an institutional scale. The various factions that would emerge in the wasteland's subsequent history and impose their visions of the right order on populations who had not requested them were operating from versions of the same failure at different scales. The Master was Fallout's most complete exploration of this pattern because his case was stripped of the political and social complications that obscure it in less extreme instances in him. The pattern was visible in its essential form, without the camouflage of legitimate institutional authority or the partial legitimacy of democratically expressed preference. What he did because he believed he was right. he was not right, and the believing was the whole of what made everything else possible. He listened at the end. He was given information that threatened everything he had built and everything he believed, and he processed it honestly, and he acted on what the honest processing produced. The wasteland is not full of this. The wasteland is full of people and institutions and factions that encounter information threatening their established positions and respond with the full repertoire of the defensive strategies available to minds that have decided what they believe and are not willing to revise it. Dismissal, distortion, the generation of counter-narratives, the application of force to the problem of inconvenient evidence. The master did none of these things in the end. He sat with what he was being shown, in the full presence of the consciousness that his transformation had produced, and he found in the data what the data said, and he drew the conclusion that the data required, and he acted on it without deflection or delay. This does not make what he did before that moment less harmful or less worthy of condemnation. It makes it more tragic. He had, from the beginning, the capacity for the honesty that ended him. He had simply, for 20 years, not been given the specific information that honesty required him to confront. Rest now, wanderer. The cathedral is long fallen, and the desert has been quiet over its ruins for many years. The army that marched from it is scattered to the wasteland's distances, and the mind that commanded it is gone, and the question it was trying to answer persists in the landscape with the patience of things that do not require acknowledgement to remain real. Let the dust settle over all of it, over the boneyard and Mariposa, and the long road that Richard Gray walked before he walked into the facility that ended him and remade him and gave him the name he chose for what he had become. Let the wind move through the broken streets of the old city and through the desert that surrounds it and across the dark face of a wasteland that has survived more than any of its inhabitants, in their various extraordinary and ordinary forms of endurance, could easily account for. The story of the master is finished for tonight. What it leaves behind is what all honest stories leave behind, not resolution, because the questions it raised do not resolve, but something like clarity about the shape of those questions, the particular way they were asked by this specific life, in this specific place, in the long aftermath of a catastrophe that remade everything and left the fundamental difficulty of being human and of caring about what happens to human beings exactly as difficult as it had always been. The fires are out, the voices are quiet, the wasteland holds you gently in its ancient, patient dark. Let your breathing slow. Let the ruins recede to the distance where ruins belong when the mind is releasing its hold on the day and turning toward the deep, still country of sleep. You have walked a long way through a difficult story, and the walking is done, and what remains is simply the dark and the quiet and the slow dissolution of the weight that the waking world asks all of us to carry. Drift now, wanderer. The watch is kept. The story continues, as all stories continue, in the lives of those who carry it forward without knowing they are carrying it, and the wasteland, patient as it has always been, endures. The ruins of the boneyard settled back into their silence after the cathedral fell, the way that ruins always settle back into silence after the thing that had animated them is gone, not immediately, not cleanly, but gradually, the way that a fire reduces itself through its own consumption until what remains is not the fire but the record of it, the ash and the altered ground, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to places where something significant has ended, and the world has not yet decided what to do with the space the ending left behind. The super mutants who had constituted the Master's army dispersed across the landscape in the months and years that followed, some of them moving north, some east, some settling into the ruins and the marginal territories of the wasteland, with the particular adaptability of beings who were, whatever else they were, extremely difficult to kill and extremely resistant to the environmental conditions that made the post-war world so costly for unmodified humans to inhabit. They were not gone. They would not be gone for a very long time, but they were no longer an army. no longer organized around a purpose that exceeded the immediate concerns of survival and territory, no longer the instrument of a philosophy that had intended to remake humanity in the image of what the changed world required. What remained, in their dispersal, was the question that the Master had asked, and that his ending had not answered. The question of whether the human form was adequate to the world the Great War had created. The question of whether the settlements of the wasteland, built with such difficulty and maintained at such cost, represented the beginning of something that could sustain itself across the generations, or whether they were the last expression of a biological inheritance that the conditions of its existence had already decided against. The Master had been wrong about the solution. He had not been wrong about the question, and the question persisted in the landscape with the same patience that the radiation persisted in the soil, invisible, constant, unaddressed by any of the immediate victories that the wasteland survivors celebrated in the aftermath of the army's dissolution. The people who had survived the Unity's 20 years of operation went back to the work of surviving. There is something in that fact that deserves to be held for a moment before moving past it, the extraordinary ordinariness of what the wasteland's communities returned to after the most comprehensive threat they had faced was removed. The farmers in the settlements north of the boneyard went back to their fields. The traders operating out of the hub recalculated their routes in light of the reduced threat on the roads that had previously carried the risk of nightkin interception and returned to the business of moving goods between communities that needed what other communities had. The people of Shady Sands continued the slow, generational project of building something that had not existed before, a community that understood itself as the beginning of something rather than the remnant of something that had already ended. They did this not because the question the Master had asked had been answered to their satisfaction, but because the work of living does not wait for the resolution of the questions that surround it, and because the human instinct toward the future, toward the next season's harvest, and the next generation's education, and the slow accumulation of the small improvements that add up across enough time to something that might be called progress, is not contingent on certainty about whether the future the instinct is oriented toward is genuinely available. Harold lived. He had always lived. Through everything, through the Great War and the years immediately following it, and the long, strange decades of his mutation, and the encounter with Richard Gray that had sent him into and out of Mariposa with his life and a low-grade FEV infection that would spend the following century remaking him in ways that were, by any external measure, very strange, and were, by Harold's own account, simply the particular form that his existence had taken, and that he had arrived at a working relationship with. The tree that grew from his head bob, he called it, with the lightness that was his signature response to the world's unreasonableness, would eventually become a forest. Harold would eventually become the root system of that forest, in the capital wasteland, in a place called Oasis, where his slowly expanding biology had produced the most significant ecological recovery that the post-war world had generated in the regions most severely affected by the bombing. Green, genuinely green, in a landscape of grey and brown and the particular desiccated colours of a world that the bombs had drained of the moisture and the biological vitality that makes colour possible. Harold's story and the Master's story began in the same place, on the same day, with the same decision to walk into a facility that both of them understood, at some level, carried a risk they were accepting rather than failing to perceive. They diverged in the vats, Harold escaping before the worst of what the facility contained could work its full transformation on him, Gray remaining to undergo the transformation in its most complete and most catastrophic form, and they converged again, in a way, in their endings, both of them becoming something that the world had not contained before their encounters with the FEV, both of them carrying the result of that encounter through decades that the pre-war world would not have allotted them, both of them arriving eventually at a relationship with what they had become that was the most honest response available to them, given what they were and what the world was, and what the distance between those two things demanded. Harold's response was gentler, more patient, more oriented toward accommodation than transformation. He accepted what he was and waited, with a curiosity that the wasteland could not extinguish, to see what it would become. The master's response was the opposite, a refusal to accept, an insistence that what was required was change rather than accommodation, a conviction that the gap between what the world was and what it should be was a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. Both responses were expressions of the same underlying reality. Two human beings made strange by the same process, finding their way through decades of a world that had not been designed for what they were. The super mutants who survived the army's dissolution and found their way through the subsequent decades, Marcus among them, intelligent and reflective, carrying his transformation with a complexity that demonstrated what the question of super mutant personhood actually required to be answered, which was not a category, but an attention, were the human legacy of the Master's program in its most direct form. They had not chosen what they were. They had been made into it by a process that had not consulted them, sustained by a philosophy that had understood their transformation as salvation, and that had been wrong about what salvation required. Their existence in the post-master wasteland was complicated in the specific ways that the existence of any being is complicated when the world's categories for understanding it were established before it existed and have not been revised to account for it. They were not welcome in most of the communities that the new California Republic was building, because the communities were building toward a definition of what the civilization of the post-war world should contain, and the super mutants did not fit comfortably within that definition. They were not simply threats, because the individuals among them, whose intelligence had survived the transformation, demonstrated with their own existence that the beings the Unity had produced were capable of wisdom and grief and the particular form of dignity that comes from enduring what cannot be changed without being diminished by it. What the Master's story asks of those who have followed it all the way to its ending is not judgment, though judgment is easier and arrives more quickly and is, in most individual cases, not entirely wrong. He caused harm on a scale that very few entities in the post-war world managed to approach, sustained across 2 decades with the full application of the most extraordinary intelligence that the wasteland had produced. The judgment is accurate. What the story asks, beyond the judgment, is the more difficult work of understanding how a mind arrives at monstrous conclusions through a pathway that felt from inside. Like reason and love, how the combination of genuine intelligence and genuine care and complete certainty can produce outcomes that are indistinguishable in their effects on the people who experience them, from the outcomes produced by the combinations that lack any of those qualities. This is more difficult than judgment and more important, because the wasteland is full of judgment and somewhat short of the understanding that might, across enough time and enough honest engagement with the evidence, produce something better. Richard Gray was not a unique case. He was an extreme case, the most extreme, that the wasteland's particular combination of circumstances and one specific facility produced, but the pattern of his failure was not unique to him. The certainty that one's analysis of the situation is sufficiently complete to justify overriding the preferences of those most directly affected by the decisions the analysis produces is not a failure exclusive to beings transformed by experimental viruses in underground military facilities. It is a failure available to anyone with sufficient intelligence to construct a sophisticated argument and sufficient commitment to a conclusion to mistake the sophistication of the argument for the correctness of the conclusion. The pre-war institutions that had built the vaults and conducted the experiments within them had operated from exactly this failure at an institutional scale. The various factions that would emerge in the wasteland's subsequent history and impose their visions of the right order on populations who had not requested them were operating from versions of the same failure at different scales. The Master was Fallout's most complete exploration of this pattern because his case was stripped of the political and social complications that obscure it in less extreme instances in him. The pattern was visible in its essential form, without the camouflage of legitimate institutional authority or the partial legitimacy of democratically expressed preference. What he did because he believed he was right. He was not right, and the believing was the whole of what made everything else possible. He listened at the end. He was given information that threatened everything he had built and everything he believed, and he processed it honestly, and he acted on what the honest processing produced. The wasteland is not full of this. The wasteland is full of people and institutions and factions that encounter information threatening their established positions and respond with the full repertoire of defensive strategies available to minds that have decided what they believe and are not willing to revise it. Dismissal, distortion, the generation of counter-narratives, the application of force to the problem of inconvenient evidence. The master did none of these things in the end. He sat with what he was being shown, in the full presence of the consciousness that his transformation had produced, and he found in the data what the data said, and he drew the conclusion that the data required, and he acted on it without deflection or delay. This does not make what he did before that moment less harmful or less worthy of condemnation. It makes it more tragic. He had, from the beginning, the capacity for the honesty that ended him. He had simply, for 20 years, not been given the specific information that honesty required him to confront. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the ending of something that was very large and very loud and very certain of itself. Not the silence of absence, which is simply the neutral state of a space that nothing is currently occupying, but the silence of aftermath, which carries the memory of what preceded it, in the same way that a room carries the memory of a conversation that ended an hour ago. You can feel it, if you are quiet enough, in the places where significant things have happened and then stopped happening, in the ruins of the cathedral, in the sealed lower levels of Mariposa, dark now and still, the vats no longer active, the automated systems long since exhausted or broken, the machinery that had conducted its work on so many human beings finally at rest, in the way that machinery rests when there is no longer anyone to maintain it or anyone for it to serve. The silence of those places was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, the particular stillness of a mechanism that has run for as long as it could and has finally stopped, leaving behind the record of its running in the physical evidence of what it produced and what it consumed. The wasteland does not memorialize easily. It does not have the institutional resources for memorialization, the museums and the archives and the designated sites of historical significance that the pre-war world had used to mark the places where important things had happened and to ensure that the people who came after would understand what those things had been. What it has instead is the physical evidence itself, present in the landscape without interpretation, available to whoever encounters it, to read or to misread or to simply move past, without registering as anything other than the general ruin that the Great War had made of everything it touched. The cathedral's ruins in the boneyard were, in the years following the master's death, simply ruins, one collapsed structure among the thousands that the boneyard contained, distinguishable to those who knew what they were looking at, and indistinguishable from the general landscape of devastation to those who did not. The specific significance of what had happened there, the particular weight of the story that those ruins contained, existed only in the memories of those who had been present for some part of it, and in the accounts that those memories generated when the people who held them chose to share them. Memory in the wasteland was the only archive that survived comprehensively, and memory was not a reliable archive. It was selective, shaped by the emotional significance of what it retained and the emotional pressure of what it needed to process, organized around the needs of the person doing the remembering, rather than around the requirements of accurate historical record. The survivors of the communities that the unity had threatened remembered the fear and the losses and the particular quality of relief that followed the army's dissolution. And those memories were real and deserved, and did not require the complication of understanding what had motivated the thing they feared in order to be honored. The vault dweller, who had descended to the master's chamber and emerged from the cathedral's detonation, carried a more complete account. But the vault dweller was one person, and one person's memory was not a permanent record, and the wasteland's subsequent history was not organized around the project of preserving what that person knew. What persisted, instead, was what always persists in the absence of formal memorialization, the effect, dispersed through the subsequent history of the world that the events had shaped, present in the political and social and biological landscape of the wastelands following decades, in ways that were real without being legible as the specific consequences of a specific cause. The new California Republic that grew from the settlements of Southern California was built partly in the shadow of what the unity had attempted. The awareness present in the founding generation of the Republic's political culture that organized force on the scale the unity had achieved could threaten the independence of every community in the region, and that the appropriate response to this threat was the kind of organized collective defense that only a political entity of sufficient scale could sustain. The Republic was not built because of the Master, but the world in which it was built had been shaped by him, and the shape was present in the institutions, even when the specific history that had produced the shape was no longer at the front of anyone's awareness. The question of what it means to love something enough to destroy it in the name of saving it is not a question that the wasteland invented, and it is not a question that the Master's story resolves. It is a question that the story poses with unusual clarity, stripped of the political and social complexity that usually surrounds it, reduced to its essential elements: the love, the certainty, the harm, the reckoning. The reckoning, when it came, was complete. That is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the Master's ending, and the thing most worth carrying forward from the long account of his existence. He did not half reckon. He did not perform acknowledgement while privately maintaining his position. He understood what he had done, and he understood what that understanding required of him, and he did it. The wasteland has seen many endings. It has seen very few that carried that particular quality of completeness, that refusal of the halfway measure, even when the measure being refused was the one that ended everything. Rest now, wanderer. Let the weight of this story find its place among the things you carry, not at the front where it would demand continued attention, but somewhere quieter, where it can do the slower work that difficult stories do, when the mind has released its grip on them and allowed them to settle into the deeper architecture of understanding, rather than the immediate architecture of response. The cathedral is long fallen, and the desert has been quiet over its ruins for many years. The army that marched from it is scattered to the wasteland's distances, and the mind that commanded it is gone, and the question it was trying to answer persists in the landscape with the patience of things that do not require acknowledgement to remain real. Let the dust settle over all of it, over the boneyard and Mariposa and the long road that Richard Gray walked before he walked into the facility that ended him and remade him and gave him the name he chose for what he had become. Let the wind move through the broken streets of the old city and through the desert that surrounds it and across the dark face of a wasteland that has survived more than any of its inhabitants, in their various extraordinary and ordinary forms of endurance, could easily account for. The story of the Master is finished for tonight. What it leaves behind is what all honest stories leave behind, not resolution, because the questions it raised do not resolve, but something like clarity about the shape of those questions, the particular way they were asked by this specific life, in this specific place, in the long aftermath of a catastrophe that remade everything and left the fundamental difficulty of being human and of caring about what happens to human beings exactly as difficult as it had always been. Richard Gray asked the hardest questions the wasteland had to offer. He arrived at the wrong answers. He was honest enough, in the end, to know it. The wasteland has seen worse. It has also seen better. What it has rarely seen is the particular combination of those qualities, the scale of the error, and the completeness of the acknowledgement that makes his story worth following all the way to the end, in the dark, in the quiet, in the long, slow drift towards sleep. The fires are out, the voices are silent. The wasteland holds you gently in its ancient, patient dark, the way that vast and broken things hold the small and tired things that rest within them, without judgment, without demand, with only the simple accommodation of space and stillness and the passage of time. Let your breathing slow to the rhythm of the open desert at night, where the air moves without urgency across distances that make all human concerns, even the largest and most consequential, feel proportionate to their actual size in the scale of things. Let the ruins recede to the distance where ruins belong, when the mind is releasing its hold on the day and turning toward the deep, still country of sleep. You have walked a long way through a difficult story, and the walking is done, and what remains is simply the dark and the quiet and the slow dissolution of the weight that the waking world asks all of us to carry. Drift now, wanderer. The watch is kept. The story continues, as all stories continue, in the lives of those who carry it forward without knowing they are carrying it. And the wasteland, patient as it has always been patient, and enduring as it has always endured, holds the silence and the ruins and the long memory of everything that happened here, and waits, without impatience and without expectation, for whatever comes next.